Elon Musk. Is there some kind of secret to this man who has made it his personal goal, no more, no less, to make humanity an interplanetary species? A man who contributed to the creation and early successes was a co-founder of the chat that was created. A man who communicates freely and informally with world leaders, presidents of Israel, Turkey, Russia, and, of course, America. A man who broadcasts his views to billions of people without restraint, even if these views go against the current agenda. Here, for example, is his speech at the World Government Forum, where he expresses concern that such a form of governance could destroy humanity.
I know this is called the World Government Summit, but I think we should maybe be a little bit concerned about actually becoming too much of a single world government. If I may say, we want to avoid creating a civilizational risk by having, this may sound a little odd, too much cooperation between governments.
Here is his quote about the so-called eco-agenda.
Take environmentalism to an extreme. You start to view humanity as a plague on the surface of the earth, like mold or something. But this is actually false. The Earth's resources could likely sustain a global population 10 times larger than the current level, while still preserving the world's forests. So the environmental movement, and I'm an environmentalist, has gone too far. They've gone way too far. If you start thinking that humans are bad, then the natural conclusion is that humans should die out.
And here he is retweeting a meme about brainwashing. Or here, for example, about the World Health Organization, when Musk saw a new high. You can buy the World Health Organization from Bill Gates and turn it into a health organization. And how much does it cost? And here is his opinion about the president of his country.
I wish we could have just a normal human being as a president. That's what I want. Honestly, it's hard for me to say what Biden is doing. The real president is the one who controls his teleprompter.
Well, his positions on controversial topics in world politics have been expressed many times in numerous interviews.
If you're not going to just outright commit genocide against an entire people, which obviously should not be acceptable to anyone, then you're basically going to leave a lot of people, living people who accordingly hate Israel. So the question is, for every Hamas member you kill, how many do you create? And if you created more than you killed, then you haven't succeeded. That's the real situation. And it's safe to say that if you killed a child in Gaza, you created several Hamas members who are willing to die to kill Israelis. I would recommend that you don't send the flower of Ukrainian youth to die in the trenches. Avoid discussing Putin altogether. Whoever attacks will suffer heavy casualties and be viewed unfavorably by history. Elon
Musk is considered the main technology visionary on the planet. And this is despite the fact that his biological father said only one categorical phrase to 17-year-old Elon when he decided to move from South Africa to Canada. You will never achieve success. It was in 1989, and 33 years later, Elon Musk became the richest person in the world. One of his companies has carried out more successful launches than anyone else in the world, and another sells electric cars by the millions. Let's take a look at how it happened that a boy with Asperger's syndrome decided to make humanity an interplanetary species. Elon Musk was born in South Africa, a country that doesn't often produce technological entrepreneurs for the world. Musk's father was an engineer, and later the owner of a not entirely legal emerald mine. He married his childhood friend May, with whom he had 3 children, one after another. Elon in 1971, Kimball in 1972, and Tosca in 1974. According to his own beliefs, Elon Musk tried to instill resilience and strength of spirit in his children. But as a result, this upbringing led to various emotional difficulties that all of Errol's children still experience to this day. Elon and Kimball, after growing up, hardly maintain any relationship with their father. He could be sweet and friendly, and a minute later he would already be waving his fists and shouting insults. He could make the children stand in front of him and lecture them for hours, they say. Despite accusations of abuse from his wife and children, Elon Musk himself gladly talks to journalists about his son, sends family photos, and reminisces. He doesn't consider his upbringing to be wrong or harsh. According to him, in South Africa, there's no other way. Weak people don't survive there. When Elon was 12 years old and his brother was even younger, they were sent to a children's military camp, which, naturally, turned out to be a survival camp. Bullying was considered a virtue there, recalls Kimball. The kids would go at each other in groups. The older ones would beat up the younger ones and take their food away. Little clumsy Elon was constantly hungry. "Don't be as stupid as that bastard who died here last year," the caretakers would advise the children. "Don't be a weak, stupid bastard." The next time, Elon ended up in the same camp at 16. By that time, he had become much bigger and had learned some judo moves, so this place no longer seemed so scary to him. In Pretoria, a city in South Africa in the 80s, it was hard to surprise anyone with domestic or street violence. At school, where Elon was the youngest and shortest in his class, he struggled. Asperger's syndrome compounded the difficulties, as people with this syndrome struggle to recognize contextual details and emotional nuances in speech, leading to social interaction problems. Speech and cognitive abilities are usually preserved and are often very high, as in Elon's case. He was quick-witted and learned excellently, but diplomacy and empathy were not Elon's strong suits. Someone was always picking on him, and as a result, he often ended up in the hospital with yet another injury. If you've never been punched in the nose, you have no idea how it affects your life, says Elon Musk. In the end, Musk grew up big and quite strong, but he admits that to this day he still feels that childhood defenselessness and awkwardness inside himself. But the broken bones and scrapes received in fights still meant much less than the emotional wounds. When Elon returned home from the hospital after yet another fight, his father said that he was beaten for a reason, because he shouldn't consider himself smarter than others. The court, however, did not agree with Elon's father and sent his son's offender to prison. "I had to stand there for a whole hour while he yelled at me, called me an idiot, and said I was just worthless," recalls Elon Musk. Kimball, who was also a witness to this scene, says that this is the worst memory of his life. The father just lost control, went into a rage, as he often did. There wasn't a drop of compassion in him. And yet, soon after Mae Musk divorced her unbearable husband in '79, Elon returned to his father. However, later he often said that the decision to live with his father from the age of 10 to 17 was the biggest mistake of his life. Why did he decide to live with the one who caused him pain? Why didn't he choose a happy family? That's what Elon's mother asked herself 40 years later. Maybe it's just because he is the way he is. However, Elon's move to his father wasn't such a mystery. He was only 10 years old, had trouble communicating, was awkward, and didn't have any friends. His mother loved him, but she was overwhelmed with work, distracted, and vulnerable. His father, on the other hand, was proud, manly, a big guy with large hands and good looks. His career had its ups and downs, but overall he felt great. He had a golden Rolls-Royce Corniche convertible, and, more importantly, a lot of wonderful books and engineering tools. That's why Elon, still a little boy, decided to live with him. Obviously, living with his father and his influence largely shaped the character of the adult Elon Musk. Despite the fear of becoming like his father, Musk possesses many of his traits. The same emotional swings, from a restrained Elon to an uncontrollable Elon, and back again in just a few minutes. The same lack of empathy and absence of any filters. The same demon mode. Elon's second wife, British actress Tallulah Riley, said in 2008 after the first 3 rockets exploded, "Inside, he's still the same child standing in front of his father." Musk achieved a level of success that neither he nor his father could have imagined. "Hardships shaped me. My pain threshold became very high," he says. And it seems that could have been enough to settle down. In his early 20s, Musk admitted that he was ready to change the mindset that had worked in crisis mode his entire life. But while promising to change, Elon, unstoppable, was secretly buying up shares and flying to Hawaii to his mentor, Larry Ellison, the founder, to discuss the takeover plan. If not the universe, then something near it. I think he doesn't know what it means to enjoy success and smell the flowers. Post-traumatic stress disorder made him believe that life is pain, says Elon Musk's ex-girlfriend, Canadian singer Grimes. Asperger's syndrome combined with high intelligence, Imagination, clumsiness, and lack of friends all partly explain Musk's childhood passion for computer games, which he has kept throughout his life. Elon Musk played, plays, and will play. He played even when he didn't have a computer. At the end of the 70s, tabletop role-playing games were incredibly popular in South Africa. Elon Kimball and their cousins frequently played the game, first amongst themselves and later in tournaments, beating adult opponents. Even then, Musk showed himself to be a brilliant strategist and analyst. Even in childhood, Elon had many different behavioral traits. His mood would swing back and forth. But, playing the role of the dungeon master, he was incredibly patient, which was actually not typical for him at all, recalls Musk's cousin, Peter Rave. Elon Musk first saw a computer at the age of 11 in a shopping mall in Johannesburg. His father refused to buy it for him. There's no need to fill your head with nonsense. Then Elon started taking any job he could find and eventually bought himself one of the first personal computers. Now he could play Galaxian and Alpha Blaster, games where you had to save Earth from aliens. That's how Musk's fascination with video games began. In addition, the computer came with a 60-hour programming course in a language that the 12-year-old boy completed in just 3 days. After that, Elon convinced his father to send him to university programming courses and began actively using the knowledge he gained. However, not always for peaceful purposes. At the age of 13, Musk created his first video game and received a fee of $500 for it from PC and Office Technology magazine. And then he hacked the security of arcade machines in a shopping mall and played video games for hours on end for free with his cousins. After moving to Canada, Musk enrolled in college, where he studied for 2 years and then moved to the United States on a scholarship from the University of Pennsylvania, where he studied physics and economics. As a student, he played strategy games for days on end. Musk gained a reputation as a fearless person, even in his childhood. Elon and Kimball were close with their cousins Lyndon, Peter, and Russ Reeve, who later also became entrepreneurs and, together with Elon, founded a company that produced household solar panels. We'll talk about their failures a little later. They were all risk-takers. Peter admitted that risk was a kind of fuel for them. But Elon was still the most daring and unstoppable of all the brothers. For him, it was always important to make decisions that weren't influenced by weakness or fear. It was like that even when he was a child, recalls Peter Rave. Once, we were riding our bicycles from Pretoria to Johannesburg, and Elon broke far ahead, and we pulled over to the side of the road to stop a passing pickup truck. When Elon realized this, he got so angry that he started hitting us. He decided that we had tried to trick him on purpose and got angry because we showed weakness. Maybe it's a tendency to take risks, a family trait of Elon Musk. His maternal grandfather, Joshua Haldeman, was a great adventurer. He moved from Canada to South Africa during the apartheid era and changed a number of quite extraordinary professions. He studied chiropractic methods and then gave consultations in exchange for food and lodging. He bred horses, was a cowboy, participated in rodeos, traveled with a rabbit on trains and ocean liners, and was involved in politics. Seeing the lavender fields in the outskirts of Pretoria, Joshua decided to settle there. And then he bought a plane, on which he traveled with his wife and 4 children, exploring the Kalahari Desert in search of ancient lost cities. The neighbors called them the Flying Haldemans. The Haldeman family had a motto: live dangerously, but carefully. But Joshua Haldeman's tendency for risk turned out to be fatal. He died when a person he was teaching to fly crashed a plane into a power line. Joshua's grandson, Elon, was only 3 years old at the time, but now he seems to understand his adventurer grandfather like no one else. He knew that real adventures are associated with risk, and risk gave him strength. Elon Musk says he constantly lives in a state of intense deadlines, with both storming and sieges happening at the same time. It feels like crisis is a necessary condition for his incredible productivity. Even when tormented by insomnia and nighttime nausea due to extreme stress, Musk almost always remains strong and full of energy. He has learned to suppress fear. But if you give up fear, then maybe you'll have to give up other things too, like joy or empathy, says Canadian writer Justin Wilson. Musk's first wife says that Musk not only doesn't know fear, but also, apparently, gets a certain pleasure from the very possibility of walking along the edge of the abyss. He wants to take risks for the sake of risk itself. It seems he doesn't just like it, he's addicted to it, says Peter Thiel, a friend and former partner of Musk Poe. Thiel and Musk had different views on doing business and, above all, on the degree of acceptable risk. Musk wanted to open something like a financial services supermarket based on the company he already had, where he was a partner and investor. From banking transactions to digital purchases and investments, transactions were supposed to happen instantly. Even back then, Musk realized that money is simply a database. But Thiel and the other partners, there were 5 of them besides Musk, were quite satisfied with the current role of the payment system for them. However, Musk was relentlessly driven to realize his idea, ignoring any objections and warnings. Partner and technical director Max Levchin, for example, repeatedly warned him about the recurring cases of fraud, which sooner or later would drive the company to bankruptcy. In addition, Musk insisted on merging PayPal with Tencom under the Tencom brand. He explained this by saying that his company had a client base twice as large and that the brand inspired more trust among users. Both of these claims were not true. At that time, both companies had about the same number of users, around 200,000. A study, secretly organized by the partners without Elon Musk's knowledge, showed that XCOM was perceived by users as a reliable, friendly brand that helps people get money. In contrast, XCOM's name was linked to a porn site, which did not instill much confidence. As a result, the founders concluded that Musk's actions posed a real threat to the company. The partners secretly agreed and removed him from his position, and later, in 2002, the company was sold for $1.5 billion, of which $250 million went to Musk. At first, I was very angry at them. I even thought about murder, but in the end, I realized it was good that they removed me. Otherwise, I would still be working there. Musk said and added, "Of course, if I had stayed, it would be worth $1 trillion now." Maybe that's how it would have been. Peter Thiel admits 20 years later that Musk understands something about risk that others don't, and by the laws of the market they shouldn't have survived either, but they succeeded. When Thiel and one of the first employees, Reid Hoffman, who later became a co-founder, were planning to write a book about their experience working at, they came up with the following title for the chapter about Musk: The Man Who Didn't Understand the Meaning of the Word Risk. A tendency to take risks can be useful when you need to get people to do what seems impossible. He knows how to make people march through the desert, says Hoffman. In addition, experience has shown how competent Musk is in a wide variety of technological and business aspects. He motivates people by understanding their profession better than they do themselves. And of course, space. Musk seriously remembered his childhood passion for space again when he turned 30. By then, he had visited his South African homeland, where he nearly succumbed to malaria and had logged 500 hours on a training aircraft. He visited a non-profit organization whose goal was the human exploration of Mars and the popularization of this project in the global community. Since then, Musk's contacts with them did not stop, and in 2002, he founded a company aimed at creating an affordable space rocket. Reading instructions for old rocket engines and reflecting on history in general, and the history of space technologies in particular, Musk came to the conclusion that progress is not at all an inevitable part of our civilization. Many great achievements have stalled and failed to develop, leaving people stuck in one place. The ancient Egyptians learned to build pyramids, but this knowledge was lost. The Romans constructed aqueducts and created other marvelous things, but all of this was lost in the Middle Ages. Do we want to tell our children that landing on the moon is the best we could do? Asks Musk. He is seriously concerned that our civilization could perish due to climate change, nuclear war, declining birth rates, or the threat from artificial intelligence. The colonization of other planets will help ensure the survival of humanity if something happens to our planet. If we are able to travel to other planets, the probable lifespan of human intelligence will be significantly greater than if we remain stuck on Earth forever, says Musk. To make humans an interplanetary species, this is how Elon Musk formulated his new mission. However, nothing interesting had happened in the space industry for several decades. Huge budgets were poured into rocket engineering, but the results remained very modest. Pricing hadn't changed since the Second World War, turning the aerospace industry into a sluggish, voracious monster. Technical specifications were handed down from above and were the same for everyone. Assembly was carried out exclusively by specialized enterprises. Musk called what was happening a dead end for innovation, leaving no chance for any kind of space colonization. For example, locking mechanisms for the space station used to cost $1,500 apiece, but an engineer was able to create a similar locking mechanism for $30. Musk calls the difference in cost between finished components and the raw materials they're made from the idiot index. If the difference is large, you're an idiot, says Musk, and he demands that his engineers minimize this gap as much as possible. If aluminum costs the supplier $100, then why should the part made from it cost $1,000? Either the design is too complicated or the manufacturing process is inefficient. The Musk method is to act, make mistakes, but quickly find the reasons for failures and correct errors. Musk's deadlines are always impossible, but somehow, in the end, they are met. And his other companies turn out to be the fastest in the industry. As a result, today Musk's space business creates the cheapest rockets and produces up to 90% of the components independently, while other space companies have about 1,000 suppliers. However, in 2008, it was on the verge of bankruptcy. The first 3 rockets launched at the Reagan test site exploded. Finding investors for new launches amid the global financial crisis turned out to be almost impossible. In the end, Musk invested his own $100 million in the project and received $20 million from Peter Thiel's fund. The 4th and 5th launches were successful, and bankruptcy was postponed by a contract with National Aeronautics and Space Administration worth $1.6 billion for 12 commercial launches to the International Space Station. And still, the desire to save humanity is not the only reason for Musk's fascination with space colonization. Elon Musk was born into a family of adventurers and grew up as a worthy successor to his predecessors, dreamers and risk-takers. Creating a base on Mars is incredibly difficult, and people will most likely die along the way, just as it happened during the settlement of the United States of America. But it will be incredibly inspiring. And inspiring things should happen in the world, says Musk. I always felt that life can't be just about solving problems. There should be room in it for great endeavors. That's what can get us out of bed in the morning. Speaking about the space program, it's impossible not to mention the Starlink project. Look at how beautiful it is. These aren't unidentified flying object parades or an alien landing party coming to conquer Earth. These are just Starlink satellites. How do they not crash into each other? The announced goal of Elon Musk, 42,000 satellites, is 8 times more than the current number of satellites in Earth's orbit. Moreover, they will have to be replaced every 5 years. That means every 5 years, 42,000 new pieces of metal will appear around the Earth, and the old, deactivated ones will continue to orbit for some time. Our only hope is that they gradually burn up in the atmosphere. Of course, there's a point of view that satellites and debris below 600 kilometers will leave orbit within a few years due to atmospheric drag, greatly reducing the possibility of the Kessler effect. But some of them may never come down. The system for their passive removal hasn't been tested yet, and if some of the satellites collide with each other, considering their huge number, the consequences for space exploration could be completely unpredictable. It might seem, what harm can small man-made debris cause? Lost bolts or pieces of plastic? But what kind of harm, for example? The photo shows the outcome of an unintentional impact between the International Space Station 0.0787 inches, thick aluminum skin, and a plastic piece moving at 4.35 miles /s. Well, or if we put it in car terms, that's just 25,200 kilometers per hour. Or here's a fragment of a 4-centimeter thick panel, shaved off tangentially by a bolt measuring 6 by 12 millimeters, flying through space at a speed of 6 kilometers per second. And if the bolt were moving at a speed of 10 kilometers per second, its direct impact with the International Space Station or a satellite would be equivalent to the explosion of an anti-tank shell. The scale of the problems that space debris flying at hypersonic speeds can cause is shown in the movie Gravity. Based on the photos of holes in the International Space Station, this statement seems fairly accurate. The pessimistic scenario is this: we will simply become prisoners on our own planet. There will be no talk of space at all then. After all, just 5 years ago, in 2017, the United States government recorded 398,984 potential collisions with space debris. Of those, 655 were emergencies. That means satellite operators were urgently notified about them so they could avoid a catastrophe by moving their satellite to another orbit. That's almost 2 serious situations a day. There are currently 34,000 large pieces of space debris with a diameter of more than 10 centimeters in orbit. Imagine that their number could double or triple in the coming years due to the efforts of a single company. In an interview with Gwynne Shotwell, investor Ron Barron, the president, asked her this question: how are you going to deal with this? How can you guarantee that you won't collide with other satellites? Her answer: imagine 30,000 people on Earth, distributed fairly evenly. You could live your whole life like that and never see another person. Brilliant. But people don't move at a speed of 25,000 kilometers per hour, and Starlink satellites are constantly crossing each other's paths. This is already happening right now, almost every night, and it's visible to the naked eye. Here's another one from the latest news. In December of last year, the European Space Agency accused someone of having a monopoly in space. It's an amazing situation. One person owns half of the active satellites in the world. De facto, he sets the rules. The rest of the world, including Europe, simply can't react quickly enough, said Josef Aschbacher, the head of the European Space Agency. And here's more. At the end of the year 2021, the Chinese authorities filed a complaint with the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs against Starlink. Their space station had to dodge satellites twice in a year. 2 Starlink satellites almost collided with it. The new Chinese space station, which they began building in April. By 2022, the Chinese analog of the International Space Station is expected to be fully operational. After that, Chinese users on social networks massively criticized Elon Musk's project, calling it a pile of space junk and an American space weapon. And about the weapon, that's really a big question. Can all the terminals, this technogenic swarm of satellite bees, be literally reprogrammed in a minute into whatever the military needs? Into a global radar, for example. Into a surveillance system, for example, tracking the trajectory of hypersonic cruise missiles? It also harms, and is already harming, astronomy. Try to shoot a time-lapse of the night sky in the United States, and you'll see this. For Russia, this is not a problem yet, except for a small region near the Far East. When Starlink launches all its satellites, you won't be able to hide from them at night anymore. This harms both amateur astronomers and observatories, making stargazing much more difficult. In the frames, a large blurry spot from a passing Starlink often appears. Here's a photo from the Cerro Tololo Inter-American Observatory in Chile. And that's just 1,500 satellites, which are already interfering with the detection of asteroids passing by Earth. Studies on this topic exist. According to the plans, the current number of 1,500 satellites is expected to increase by approximately 30 times. This is supposed to be a revolutionary technology that will deliver awesome internet to every corner of the planet. But even back in the 1990s, several well-funded companies tried to create their own constellations of hundreds and thousands of satellites, including a company backed by Bill Gates. There was talk of a new space race and changing the world with ubiquitous satellite connectivity. But by the early 2000s, all these projects had either gone bankrupt or changed their plans. They realized that their expenses were too high, and the final product wasn't popular anywhere except fishing boats and oil rigs. Only 2 companies could have survived to this day. They had to drastically reduce the number of satellites and sell their expensive services to large clients, traders, and emergency rescue services. But even today, these companies are actively losing money. For example, the system created by Motorola in 1997 with its constellation of 66 active satellites also operated in low orbit, although higher than 780 kilometers. Now it loses about $60 million every year. In general, technologies like these were available to us back in the 90s, but turned out to be of no use to anyone. On the other hand, the world and the market are changing. Maybe now is the right time for them? Maybe 42,000 satellites instead of just 4? Visibility in the sky and a greater impact on the surrounding space. These aren't bugs, they're features. After all, that's what allows the project to stand out from all its competitors who calmly provide the same service and call themselves innovative. Of course, this innovation also has other boring limitations that people somehow don't usually talk about in polite society. First, the dishes heat up so much that they can't operate in conditions below -30 degrees Celsius or above +40 degrees Celsius, which rules out the far south of the United States in summer and the far north in winter. For example, a beta tester in Arizona had to regularly hose down his device when it overheated. Here's, for example, how cats love to warm themselves on such a dish. And if you have a tree in front of your house, that's also unfortunate. Even leaves can block the signal, and the connection will be very poor. Second, satellite constellations will never be better than regular wired connections in terms of quality. They'll only be worse. Because, in fact, for data transmission, they still rely on the same wired internet. They depend on it. Cable connections will always be faster, more reliable, and cheaper than non-existent space-based data centers. The real reason to pay for it is only for people who don't have wired internet. And in the United States and Europe, that's a very small percentage of the market. Third, it is believed that Musk's satellite system has one advantage: ping. Because the satellites fly very low, the ping is less than 60 milliseconds. That's why the service is promoted as a cool thing for gamers. That's exactly why they need 42,000 satellites, for low ping. Their satellite competitor works perfectly with 20 satellites, covering the entire planet. They actually have only 4, and that's quite enough. The companies have 2 million clients in America, and their upload and download speeds are no worse than theirs. But their satellites are located far out in orbit, 36,000 kilometers away, with the speed of light being 300 kilometers per millisecond and the need to transmit data back and forth. This results in a minimum ping of 240 ms, but in reality it's much higher at around 630 ms. Their satellites are only 550 kilometers from Earth. That's why so many are needed to provide sufficient coverage. But this gives a theoretical ping of 3.7 milliseconds. Right now, the value is much higher, but Musk ultimately promises to bring it down to 20 milliseconds. And his promise seems quite realistic. Actually, that's what the grant was given for: internet with low ping in certain regions of the country. However, the commission later stated that the project fails to meet its standards and expressed overall dissatisfaction with the technology. But by then, Musk and Shotwell had already received the funds. Now, gaming through it is not very pleasant because of regular disconnects. But the company promises that when the number of satellites in orbit reaches at least 12,000, the interruptions will stop and the ping will remain low. Are there really that many wealthy gamers who suffer from high ping in remote regions of the planet? That's the question. So far, most of the clients are residents of metropolises like Los Angeles. They want to try out the new technology. For such people, neither the ping nor the download speeds promised by the provider will ever be reached. The more people connect to a single satellite, the slower it starts to work. And since the satellites are constantly orbiting, it's not possible to ensure a higher concentration of them over large cities. 4 satellites will orbit around the entire Earth, rather than staying in place near large cities. 71% of the planet is oceans. Europe occupies 2.1%, the United States 1.9%, and Japan 0.7%. For distant satellites. Or it's not a problem, but satellites will spend most of their time basically flying over nothing. Only 5% of them will be able to serve their clients. Even now, with the reported 145,000 users, the data transmission speed is suffering. Some users in Los Angeles get 36 megabits per second download speeds on a good day, while in Seattle, with a much smaller population, from 165 megabits per second to 50 megabits per second. For comparison, again, with its 4 satellites, it provides a stable 1,265 megabits per second, depending on the plan. Fifth, Elon Musk himself has mentioned several times that the project is not doing well and could soon go bankrupt, the last time being 6 months ago, that we urgently need to raise $30 billion. The collapse of the company could also bury the one that is supposed to become its main client. Here's another failure point for the entire system. According to an email from Musk to employees, they still aren't able to make enough engines for the ships to be able to launch the required number of satellites. Basically, there's no money, and it's unclear how to make any. It is expected that in order to raise those very $30 billion, the company may soon go public. Although this may seem a bit paradoxical, to offer the general public the opportunity to invest in a business that is on the verge of bankruptcy and has no prospect of becoming profitable in the foreseeable future. But that never actually happened, right? But surely the smartest person alive couldn't deceive the public or fail to grasp basic numbers, right? But here's a question for you. Does anyone still remember about O? In the early 2010s, this was Elon Musk's main project, Our Future. A solar roof over every house, a real miracle, a revolution in the energy sector. There was an identical business model there. Solar panels were produced at a loss, like a dish that costs $500 but has a production cost of $1,300. The panels were installed on the homes of those who signed up on the waiting list and wanted them. It also didn't run on Musk's money, and in fact, it actually belonged to Peter and Lyndon Reeve, his cousins. They financed themselves with government money, receiving grants for renewable energy from California and the state of New York. And they also sold bonds to investors, promising to pay them back as soon as they established cash flow. The more people wanted to install such panels for themselves, the worse things went for the company. It also turned out that many of the bonds were bought through companies belonging to Musk using government money that was intended for other purposes. After all, by 2015, Musk had already received $4.9 billion from the government for his projects. The production of solar panels stalled. They turned out to be not as effective as the billionaire claimed, and were often defective. For example, after a series of fires caused by the panels, the company sued them. According to them, damage to the surface of the panels led to the formation of hotspots, which became sources of ignition. And the cracks that appeared on the panels were patched up by Musk's company employees with adhesive tape, which also later caught fire. Such high technology. There weren't many real buyers, but even so, there wasn't enough product to somehow finance themselves in 2012. It went public and raised several $100 million from a wide range of investors who believed in Villain and his. Despite constantly operating at a loss, the company struggled on for a few more years, and its shares even rose when some positive news appeared. Until it turned out that it was bankrupt, with debts of $3 billion. The business model didn't work. To save it from bankruptcy, Musk used Tesla's money and bought it for $2.6 billion, basically from himself. Now, for this deal, Tesla shareholders are trying to recover $13 billion from Elon Musk, arguing that this is outright fraud, and the company, which was bankrupt and had no technology behind it, was clearly not worth that much. Well, maybe he himself didn't know if the solar panel technology would work out. Sometimes people just promise too much. But here you have, so to speak, an example of clear and direct deception. In the year 2013, Musk stated that Tesla cars would be able to operate as robotaxis as early as the following year, allowing owners to send their cars out onto the street to earn money for them by transporting passengers. A car costing $35,000, according to Musk, was supposed to earn you up to $30,000 a year, even taking into account electricity expenses. That means an annual return of 85%. You'd be crazy not to buy a Tesla right now. The company's shares soon quadrupled from $8 to $32. According to Musk, this was the main reason to buy Tesla. No matter how much the car costs, in the future it will bring you even more money. In 2014, at a forum with investors, he promised this again for the following year. In 2016, again for the next year. And in 2019 and in 2020, he recently promised again it would certainly occur next year. So it's already been 9 years in a row. Of course, all of this is just empty and cheap lies. If cars could generate $30,000 a year, they wouldn't cost $35,000. Investment funds, companies, taxi fleets would all want to get them for themselves. And the price for such cars would rise to a fair $300,000. Such cars would no longer end up in the hands of ordinary buyers. Moreover, why would a company sell such cars that generate 85% a year? If that were really the case, Tesla would simply keep them for itself and become the world's largest taxi operator, like a more advanced Uber with its own personal taxi fleet. Musk couldn't have failed to understand that his numbers and words about the future of technology don't correspond to reality at all. However, the man ranked first globally by Forbes can't simply be an ordinary fraud. Engineers are working, Tesla cars are driving millions of kilometers, and rockets are transporting cargo and people. And this video, as it's called, by definition, can't be considered an investment recommendation.
What would you say to people who say you've been saying this year, next year for several years now? What would you tell them this year? Perfect.
To be continued in the second part of our series. We will release the second episode literally in a few days. It will be no less interesting, as you'll discover who controls billions in finances, Elon Musk. What substances does the founder take, and who can get into the school of the planet's main technological visionary? About this and much more, no less interesting, very soon. Don't miss it. Turn on notifications now. We promise the episode won't disappoint. See you soon.